This next plant I'm going to cover has been one of the most popular plants to be sold as a medicine in the United States ever since about 1880s. Most people know this plant, and the plant is, gang?
Echinacea!
That's right, Echinacea. Variously pronounced differently, but Echinacea is generally its correct pronunciation. Echi means sharp or hedgehog-like. Like Echinops is a plant that has edges or sharp spines on it too. So I want to spend a little bit of time on Echinacea and its use in first aid. So it's a vastly popular herb. The advantages to that, and this is true in medicine in a clinic or medicine in a first aid station, is that if people have heard of a product before, in this case a plant, it often instills confidence, which increases compliance, which allows the plant to even work stronger. So just by people using it. But actually I would say some amount of less resistance to something could be helpful in itself. So Echinacea is known to lots of people. So when somebody comes in for a problem, cold or flu or whatever the various problems I'll discuss, and I say I'd like to give you some Echinacea, often a hint of a smile and a feeling of openness comes because it's just more like, it's like introducing them to a friend or something, like, oh, it's good to see Ben again, and it's good to see Echinacea again. So there is a real strong place for it. Echinacea is one of those plants that is probably overused, but in my mind, it's still a very valuable plant, despite its kind of over-popularity and over-accentuatedness and more money devoted to Echinacea studies than pretty much every plant put together. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but that's how it feels. Because of its popularity, there's also a lot of misconceptions about Echinacea, and I'd like to address a few of those. So first, by Echinacea, I mean three species that are used commonly and somewhat interchangeably. They're Echinacea purpurea. Echinacea, once again, means spiny. It's not that spiny, but the top of the receptacle of the flower is chafy, and you can feel it's rough up there. The purpurea means purple. All of them have varying shades of lavender and purple, the ones I'm talking about today. And Echinacea purpurea is a plant of moist, fertile soils of the east and Ozarks and basically kind of east of the plains in rich, woodsy, fertile soils. I want to say this about all three Echinacea species that I'm covering. They shouldn't be gathered. It's easy enough to grow. Lots of people grow them in large scale, and you can buy them by people who grow them organically. It's an easy plant to find, organically cultivated, and it's definitely decimated from the wilds. Ever since it's become popular, its resurgence of popularity in the 70s and definitely the 80s and even more the 90s has meant that a lot of people have taken it from many of the places where it's native to. And so I would really suggest don't gather it from the wilds, but to grow it. So Echinacea purpurea, you do sometimes see it, and since Echinaceas are very pretty and long-term perennials, you often see them grown on roadsides and in road meridians. They're not native there. It's just that people like to put wild flower seeds down, and Echinacea is just one of the more popular ones, which is great. It's beautiful to look at. It attracts a bunch of insects, and for those of us who like plants and medicinal, it's just nice to see it. It's extravagant spread around. Echinacea pallida is another species that's more in the Midwest. And then on the western edge of the Echinaceas, in other words, in the Rocky Mountains, in the dry soils, you have Echinacea angustifolia. So three Echinaceas. Echinacea purpurea, native in woodland soils in the east. Echinacea pallida, more in the Midwest, and Echinacea angustifolia, more in the dry calcareous soils, dry, not very fertile soils of, usually I see it in Texas and on the east end of the Rockies. So an Echinacea angustifolia is angustifolia, which means lance-leafed. And the way that the flower, what look like petals, droop is very different than purpurea, which are rounder and more upright. And then in the middle is pallida, which is somewhat of a hybrid or a cross between the purpurea of the east and the angustifolia. of the West. So we have 3 species. And then the questions that are common are which species works the best. And for me, that's not the best question because pretty much most people grow Echinacea purpurea for medicine. So if you want it, most likely you're going to get purpurea. The reason for it is I'm not really sure why people don't grow angustifolia. It grows in a more hard-packed soil. It's not the hardest plant to grow, but it's just not commonly on the market. So all 3 species are good medicines. Given my choice, I used to like Echinacea angustifolia. The root of the plant was my favorite medicine out of all the echinaceas and plant parts, but it's been wildly taken out of the ground. There's very little left. Nobody's growing it, so I just don't use Echinacea angustifolia, and that's what I would suggest unless you're growing it yourself. Pellita, I just don't see on the market very much. It grows in the prairies, and there's no real reason to gather it. When lots of people grow purpurea, especially people like Pacific Botanicals in Oregon, and they're some of my favorite people to buy plants from, so I buy fresh Echinacea purpurea from them. So I hope that makes sense. Those are the 3 species. Most likely you'll be using purpurea, which works very well, so it's not really a matter of qualification there. As far as the plant parts, the 3 parts that are used are the flower tops, the leaves, and the roots. Echinacea is a perennial. You want to give the plant a couple of years to get a good yield and just strength to the roots. The roots are the strongest medicine. There's some, questioning of this. My personally using it, the roots seem the strongest. Probably the flower heads are the second strongest, and the leaves the least. But all of them have some potency. But since I'm trying to make medicines that's really strong, since I'm using it in first aid and want to limit how much I give, I tend to make the fresh root tincture. So every year I buy some from Pacific Botanicals. I tincture the fresh root, 1 to 2, 95%. So I make a whole bunch of Echinacea purpurea tincture, 1 to 2, 95. And then if I'm growing it, which sometimes I do or friends grow it, if I gather the roots, I also save the leaves and the flower for tea, but I don't really use it in first aid. So mostly I'm using fresh root of Echinacea purpurea for tincture, first aid, and for most situations. Echinacea has a well-deserved reputation because it stimulates immunity. Some plants, like golden seal Oregon grapefruit, they might stimulate some immunity, but often the chemistry in them, the chemicals that make up these plants that are used, kill things directly. When that substance meets the microbes, it has the ability to kill some of the microbes, bacteria, let's say. Echinacea, while it's not really well studied or not really well known, for my mind, what it does better is that it stimulates our immunity to kill things. That means, by the way, that if the person is immune compromised, that Echinacea might not be the best medicine because you're trying to stimulate immunity for somebody who, let's say, is on immune suppressive drugs or has an immune compromised disorder. So Echinacea shouldn't be used across the board with everybody, but with most people who have a substantial or usable immunity, then Echinacea, it could be a really good choice. The beauty of it helping your body establish and kill things just means that your body, like when you raise one set of defenses of immunity, often many sets of your defenses really works as one function. It's just a matter of moderation and how much at one point, how many white blood cells get active, which kinds of white blood cells get active, what elevation they reach, in proportion to each other. So Echinacea, for me as a first aid worker, its main purpose, and the reason I like it so much, is that I see it stimulate innate immunity. Innate immunity is the kind of immunity that's initially instigated with any kind of onset of infections and a whole host actually of health issues. The first layer of our immune response to, let's say, bacteria in our skin or a virus just getting in is often our innate immune cells. Such things as macrophages and neutrophils, and then a lot of the other cytokines that come into play early on in infections, let's say a dog bite, are innate immunity. This is as opposed to adaptive immunity. Adaptive immunity is the T and B cells and a few other cells. So adaptive immunity is an immune memory responding or learning to gain a memory innate immunity, basically, since you're born, the earliest stages, it's the white blood cells that just do the same thing over and over and over again in response to threats to the body. In first aid, those are often our consideration. Somebody gets bit by something or stung by something. They get a bacterial infection or even the beginnings of a virus. And the innate immunity is the first part of it that gets stimulated. And in my mind, innate immunity is kind of the first aid immunity, right? It's the, like, if innate immunity doesn't work, if we don't work as first aid herbalists, then people go for like the hired hands, and you might have to go for more professional help, whoever that is. And in my mind, that's how innate immunity is. It's the first part of immunity to come onto the scene and try to clear up the detritus before it gets worse. And then if it doesn't work or if it needs more, then adaptive immunity shows up. Adaptive is formerly called acquired immunity, T cells, B cells, and the things that form a memory and can directly and indirectly kill a host of microorganisms in our body. So I hope that makes sense, and that's the beginning of talking about echinacea. In my mind here, stimulating innate immunity for the early onset of getting your white blood cells stimulated during an infection. Because of that, I use it widely and freely. So there are some people that have allergic reactions to a couple of plants in the Asteraceae. So Echinacea is in the largest family of plants. Other plants we've talked about being in the Asteraceae have been Arnica, and one or two others maybe. The Asteraceae is a huge family. Some people have cross-reaction allergies to things in the Asteraceae. Another thing in that family is chamomile, for instance, that some people are allergic to. By the way, the other name for the Asteraceae is the Compositae. So every once in a while, somebody might have an allergic response to Echinacea, but I haven't clearly seen it yet, meaning I haven't seen it, meaning if I've seen it, I haven't noticed it and it hasn't been a very strong response. The point of that is that generally I find Echinacea very safe. So there might be times not to use it with people with immune system disorders. And many times it doesn't work. All the plants and all the drugs I know at times don't work. But if we take those two things out of the docket, Echinacea is just really widely useful for people of all different ages and all different body types and constitutions, and really just a matter of frequency and dosage of people taking them, how much and how regularly. So if somebody injures themselves, if somebody has a wound on them, and I'm going to give them an activated charcoal poultice, maybe some Oregon grapefruit if I think it's infected, most likely you can also give Echinacea to just make sure that their innate immune system is stimulated at a point where it also can help clear up any detritus or any problems before they get worse. So for instance, a dog bite, if somebody gets bit by a dog and comes to me, and dog bites often get infected and swollen, I'm probably going to suggest to that person about 2 dropperfuls of Echinacea. So 2 dropperfuls is about 2.5 milliliters. A 1 ounce bottle is 30 milliliters, just to give you a sense of proportion here. And they're going to take about 2 dropperfuls, about 2.5 milliliters of Echinacea, and then probably do that for the first day every 2 to 4 hours. In other words, hitting very hard on stimulating the innate immunity to react to any possible infection for the dog bite. So that's one way that I use Echinacea. But also just colds and flus, just to get your the person's body more up to snuff, ready to counter the viruses or the secondary bacterial infections. These are some of the ways that I use Echinacea. Sometimes when people are in the midst of being very sick, I do lay off the Echinacea. So if somebody has a really bad staph infection and the staph is spreading and nothing's really helping, and I'm still working on the person, I probably won't use Echinacea. At that point, their own immune defenses are fully stimulated and engaged. And using Echinacea is really just more of a waste of tincture. There are other herbs that you might want to use at that point, but Echinacea, at that point, it's reached its limit of its effectiveness. Other times I use Echinacea that are a little less common. I use it when people have poison ivy rashes, and somebody just taught me to try that, and I've found that effective. So poison ivy and poison oak rashes, while the person has the rash, sometimes I give them Echinacea. I'm not sure really of the rationale for doing it, but some of the time it seems to reduce the severity of the itching, which is the whole goal of that, since usually they go away with time. With food poisoning or water poisonings, as I've talked with other herbs, I'll often give Echinacea. Any kind of venomous bite or sting, lots of Echinacea. Any kind of scorpion bites, rattlesnake bites, I don't work with many rattlesnake bites, occasional rattlesnakes or their cousins, the Shire copperheads, Echinacea. You know, if I talk about snake bites, of course you have to be aware of the deadly possible consequences. So, but I do give Echinacea. Sometimes rattlesnake bites are not particularly serious. Sometimes they're small bites, not a lot of venom, and you can deal with it on site. I'm saying that as if it's laissez-faire, and I'm cavalier about the approach, but there are times when that's the approach. Also, if you go to a hospital, you're starting to incur lots of costs. Of course, though, if the patient's life has any risk or you're worried about complications, then money is a secondary factor involved. So be cautious with people with autoimmune conditions. Sometimes with Echinacea, people have talked about it stimulating somebody who has white blood cells that are already overstimulated with, let's say, Graves' disease or a lupus, that Echinacea could possibly increase that white blood cell stimulation and create a greater problem. I haven't seen that's been recognizable, but it seems a very reasonable thing to look out for. Anything that's going to stimulate white blood cells could be contraindicated in autoimmune conditions. Though it gets tricky, right? Because the body's not so dopey all the time like that. Like something that stimulates just might stimulate part of it, but not the part of the white blood cells that are attacking different body organs and tissues. So mostly I use Echinacea tincture. Usually I use Echinacea purpurea tincture, and it's something I would suggest bringing in your first aid bag. The one maybe downside to it, or the one inconvenience of Echinacea, is that you need a lot of it. Like Echinacea is something I bring in 4 and 8 ounce size bottles, and I often bring it not with a dropper top, but with a squeezy top, so I could just, if I'm going to give a person a cup and some water, I can just squeeze it instead of doing a couple of half dropperfuls, because when you try to fill up a dropper, often you just get half droppers. So I can actually give people more at once. The flavor is somewhat bad, but not the worst of all of them. It have that tingly feeling. So I recommend, if you're going to do first aid, is to learn Echinacea, understand about its stimulating innate immunity and good times to use that. Sometimes people talk about Echinacea that it can't be used over and over and over again because it'll run out of its effectiveness. There was a study. The study was pretty flawed. But even more than the study not being flawed is if something doesn't work after a while, it's probably best to give it a rest. So if you're using Echinacea because somebody's chronically ill, and they're still chronically ill, and they still take Echinacea, I'm not sure you'd want to just keep giving more and more of something that's not having the effect you're looking for. So that's it for Echinacea, and on to the next herb.